Okay, so we are now entering into the third phase, third section of this program, the course, okay? And what we're going to be looking now, you have that on your syllabi, but what we're going to be looking at is what is happening really in terms of the move. And we're going to be getting now a little bit technical in terms of certain things that we'll be looking for. So we want to know what's happening with the WTO. Why is it that WTO makes sense? What are the weaknesses that it has? How it has really mobilized. Many of the things that we said in the second section are going to be repeated, but now we're going to be looking at them as part of the history of transformation of GATT into WTO, okay? Then we're going to go into specific aspects of how these type of things are working or not working in the world. So the first one that we're going to be talking about is, as I put here, Quo Vadis Europe. Where are you going, Europe? This is the combination of what's happening in the European Union, what is the process of integration of the European Union, what are the lessons that we are learning from that process, and what could be the future of that, not only in terms of the agreement that you all know, but also other agreements that exist between and amongst European countries. Then the third thing we're going to be looking is what happens in other regions like Latin America. How is Latin America trying to integrate itself? What is the combination of things that we saw in the last class that we had the debate? For instance, okay, there was something called Free Trade of the Americas Agreement. Is that really going to take place? Is it dead as everybody thinks that it's dead? What would have been the consequences of having had that as an agreement? And what's the difference between that and something that is going through the mind of people like President Chavez when he's talking about ALBA as a different concept of association and agreement and integration, okay? And of course, we have to look at Mercosur and all the other Latin American agreements that we have, such as the ALADI, which is a very special type of agreement in terms of trade. But there are many efforts in Latin America, and many more are happening right now, and we would like to see what that means, what happens. I have a very specific perspective on this one, which I will be presenting to you, but that's my perspective, okay? And so you have to be careful, okay? This is what I think, doesn't necessarily mean it's right. But basically my concept is the true integration can only happen if businesses integrate. If we really have all these nice advantages that you can get as an enterprise if you set up shop in 3, 4, 5 different countries and you take the advantage of each one of those countries for the final product they will be producing. That moment then implies that you're a multinational corporation. You may be a Mexican corporation, but you're a multinational corporation, and therefore you went into the integrating process that is important for the future, integrating production chain into the process of integration of any region, okay? Other than that, in my opinion, they are dreams, okay? When you talk about all these things, it's a dream, and it's nice, and yes, I mean, I wish that we had this friendship and brotherhood and everything else, but doesn't pass through that. Okay? You have to do something else. If you don't see profit in what you are doing, it's very complicated to really have the integration in the process, okay? But that's my opinion. And then, of course, what are the kind of globalization and cooperation treaties that we have all around the world? Then the integration within and with Asia. This is very important because what's happening now, Asia is becoming the center of growth for the world. And if it is true that Asia is going to become that, then what you will be seeing in the next 10, 15, 20 years, your lifespan is a transformation of the relevance of regions. And therefore, Asia becoming the dominant region for all practical purposes. First, trade production, and then politically speaking. That transformation is probably going to be the most spectacular the world is going to be facing in the coming years, because so far we have been very much Eurocentrists, okay? We have this concept that everything comes from Europe, and then, of course, the United States, which is the substitute of Europe. But once you move into Asia, the concept of life is very different from the concept of life in Europe and even Latin America, okay? And it's not only a transformation from the economic standpoint, you also have to realize that there's going to be a cultural transformation in what's going to be happening in the future in the world. We are facing a little bit of that with the tension with China, but China is moving slowly into becoming a global power. Right now it is, but it's not, okay? They are yet global in many things, but very regional in others. What's going to happen sooner or later is if China does not split into different provinces and you have a unified China continuing in the long run, then one of the things that you'll be seeing is China becoming an imperial state. Okay? As it becomes an imperial, not in the sense of imperial emperor, but in the sense of presence in the overall magnitude. And you cannot avoid that simply because they have 1.3 billion people, okay? Yeah, but then you look at India, and India is going to be the most populous country in the world in the next 25, 30 years. It's going to surpass China. Because China, this one-child policy has stopped, in many ways, growth. Many of the problems that China will be facing come from the fact that they decide to have this one-child policy, and they're going to have all kinds of trouble. Now, we may not get into those issues because they don't belong to this class, but they are important issues that you will have to take note, because it will affect the way you do business in the future. Okay? It's not the same to think about what happens to China when they don't have any population to take some jobs that they may be creating, as China if it had been continually growing in population. So once they hit that top, how many people, they are going to start having trouble. In addition, there are cultural and there are very serious gender problems in China. Because since the one-child policy transformed itself because of cultural reasons into I want boys, I don't want girls, one of the difficulties you're going to be facing in China in the next 40 years is the ratio between female and male population. Now, that may be a plus for people here who are from the man side of the question, but there's going to be much more need for women there, okay? So they are all going to go there. Integration within and with Asia then is important. We started with APEC, and we're moving now into the trade for the Pacific. And then we need to see something that very few people looked at. What is the role of the Arab world? What is going to be that role in terms of the future of the world? Because, in fact, we talk about OPEC, but we really don't understand the role that the Arab world is beginning to get as the financial source for the rest of the world. Okay? There are countries which have large population in the Arab world, but there are many more countries which not such a large population with a lot of money. And they have become the heads of the sovereign wealth funds, investment for the rest of the world. So what kind of integration can we see happening in the Arabic world is important for us. But in the end, what will be also important for us will be, will they really think about integrating themselves, or will they be willing to integrate into the rest of the world in a different fashion? And then, of course, the lost region, okay, that we pay very few attention to, which is Africa, and all the system integration. Now, if you think about Latin America's dreams, Africa is even worse, okay? There are many more dreams in Africa about integration and brotherhood and all that, which have not taken place. But they are full of these type of things. At one point, I was running for the World Bank, all these combinations, and talking to all these countries and what should be done. And it was very complicated because when you move from one country to the next, the difference in the production process and the structure, social structure, made it very difficult that whatever you put on paper, they really did on reality. So this is the objectives for this section, okay? And we're going to start with a projection of something which I just found, which I thought it was quite interesting because it gives a quick glimpse of what is this transformation from GATT into WTO, okay?
Now, I don't want to give anyone the false impression that tariffs are out of control. In fact, on average, tariffs on traded goods are lower than they were at any point in the 20th century. Let me give you a little background first. In the 1920s, when Herbert Hoover was running for office, he made a campaign promise to U.S. farmers to protect them from foreign competition if he was elected to office. Once he was elected, he needed legislative support to get a bill moving through Congress. Getting started wasn't so bad. Legislators from farming states are more than happy to sponsor such a bill. But that wasn't enough votes to actually get it passed. So what do you do if you're seeking support for a farming protection bill from people who care nothing about farming? What if, for example, you're approaching a representative from Detroit? How do you make the proposed bill more interesting? Add a line or two about protecting automakers, perhaps? And so it went. A little something for car makers, furniture producers, textile manufacturers. In the end, the Smoot-Hawley bill entailed protection for over 20,000 U.S. products. Now, other countries in the world weren't sitting idly by as Smoot-Hawley was making its rounds. They were, to say the least, rather unhappy at the prospect of restrictions on so many of their own products. In an attempt to stop the U.S., other countries threatened to impose restrictions of their own if Smoot-Hawley passed. Some countries, like Canada, wrote up their own protectionist legislation, while others simply said that they would boycott U.S. products. Nonetheless, in 1929, the Smoot-Hawley Bill became law, the first shot in a global trade war. Between 1929 and 1932, the total volume of world trade fell from a total value of about $3 billion to only $1 billion, making Smoot-Hawley one of the major contributing factors to the Great Depression. Europe was soon embroiled in World War II, with the U.S. to follow. After the war, countries around the world agreed that perhaps the trade brawl had been a mistake that ought not to be repeated, and many of them sat down and formed an agreement to begin scaling back the tariff restrictions. This was the birth of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. At their highest, around 1930, the average level of tariffs on traded goods was at about 70%, nearly doubling the prices on imported goods. With the first full round of GATT in 1947, tariffs were reduced to about 40%, and then reduced further with each subsequent round. By 1993, GATT was in its ninth round, the Uruguay round, and tariffs were down to about 2 to 3% average on traded goods. Here's the thing, though. Just because governments have agreed to cut tariffs, does this mean that the weak domestic industries stop wanting protection? No. So if you sign an agreement that says your country won't use tariffs, does this necessarily mean that no protection will be used? No. In fact, with the decline in tariffs came an increase in quotas. So then, GATT began to address quotas. With the decline in quotas came an increase in the use of voluntary export restraints, VERs, or other non-tariff barriers, NTBs, like health and safety restrictions. Take a look at the duration of each round. Do you notice that each round gets longer and longer? That's because, 1, it gets harder and harder to trim the fat. 2, the most contentious products, usually agriculture, kept getting put on the back burner. And 3, the Uruguay round was the first to try to deal with the trade restrictions placed on services. Back when GATT started, it was dealing only with hard goods like cars and refrigerators. Trade in financial services, technical consulting, and the like didn't appear until later. It took the better part of 9 years to complete the Uruguay round, and when it was done, not only were there reductions in protection, but also the old GATT was gone. It evolved into the World Trade Organization, or WTO. The WTO is meant to serve as a place for trade dispute mediation. If one country has a complaint about another country's trade policies, that complaint can be heard by the WTO. Here's an interesting tidbit from The Economist magazine. As of 2009, the U.S. was the single most challenged country, i.e., the country that has had the most complaints lodged against it for unfair trade policies. However, we are also the single largest complaining nation. The U.S. has lodged more complaints against other countries than any other single nation. Keep these facts in mind for a WTO discussion that we'll be having in our next face-to-face class. Next time, trade blocks.
So what we saw is the transformation and the reasons for that transformation, okay? And what you saw is exactly the discussion. Look at how trade moves. First, I start talking about goods. And so when I talk about goods, I talk about something which is very important. I want free movement of my goods. So I start saying, what is the kind of barriers that I impose for the free entry of goods into an economy? So the first one, of course, is tariffs. And the second one became quotas. Okay? So when we start with GATT, the definition was, how do you reduce tariffs in total trade in the world? And the whole business of GATT was bringing down the reduction of tariffs. And as you saw during the several rounds that you were looking there, you started seeing things like tariffs grow from 70% on a global basis to about 4% at the end during the Uruguay round. Now, what that implies is one of the ways that I can protect my industry is diminishing, and therefore I am eliminating one of the barriers of trade. Yeah, of course, then I invented quotas. Fine, you can have zero tariff, but you can only bring 10,000 cars. Quotas, yes. Okay. Yeah. And so what's going to happen then is I'm going to be bringing things that are called quantitative barriers, okay? And so what I'm imposing is specific processes through which I reduce the number of things that can get into my economy, either because I increase artificially the cost by imposing a tariff, and so I make it too expensive for people to buy it, or because I specify very clearly a number of how many of those things can get into my country. When you look at it, and when you look, what you saw in the video is the whole point of, because I wanted to make the definition of trade happen, I needed the votes in Congress of as many people as possible so that I can pass a bill in that regard. And when I started going as a good politician and talking to the constituency in my own circuit, I will ask the person and say, well, let me see, Puebla, textiles. And so, yes, I will agree on free trade on the condition that everything else is free except textiles. And so I start putting a long list. And I say, okay, you're going to be giving me protection on textiles. Okay? Why? Because this is important to the state of Puebla. Okay, so now we have the senator and the deputies from the state of Puebla ready to vote for the trade bill. But then I go to San Luis Potosí, okay? And they tell me, well, here is tunas, okay? So unless, and this is not tuna like in the fish, this is the other product, tunas. And they will say, you can do everything except tunas. Or you can say olives, yeah? Because I'm not going to be allowing the olive industry to be destroyed. And as I move from place to place to place to place to gather votes, each and every one of us is adding in that trade bill something that I want to protect because it's important for my own region, for my own constituency. The political process is complicated because of that. Because what people will do is they will be defending the things. This is the origin before GATT. And so what happened in the 1929-33 period was that we had a depression. And part of the depression is because instead of promoting free trade, we promoted protection. As a result of that, you saw that little thing where you had this long list of petitions. As I go with my long list of petitions and I put the trade bill of that concept, someone in other countries is going to say, wait, if you protect your people, I protect my people. And so you go exactly in the opposite direction of what you should be going. You are not going for free trade, you are going for less and less free trade. We started with tariffs, we went to quotas, and then, of course, we go to what's called non-quantitative trade barriers, okay? Which is basically get out of these two and start imposing standards. And then I say, well, you know, if you're going to bring a car, it has to be a car that has a control for emission of pollutants of 10%, no more. So your engine and everything else will have to give me, as a result of their functioning, 10% pollutants. And then I say, well, no, we are a seriously environmental concerned country. We say 5%. And so the company which started producing cars with 10% maximum emission of pollutants will end up now not being able to send this car into that country because this country is asking for 5%. This is the barriers that we're talking about, non-quantitative barriers. These are another type of things. And those exist more and more and more, okay?
Are those standards, I mean, like only for when you're importing a product, or it's also...
Just for domestic production, and therefore importing or not importing, that's what you have to qualify. But if the company that was creating cars in the other country, which is more efficient than you are, had a standard of 10%, and you say, well, mine is 5%, then they won't be able to sell. Not because the car is not good, but because it does not fulfill the pollution standards that you have in your country. I'm using this because it's very typical, okay? But you can think of many things, you know, medicines, this, that, and you will invent things to protect your industry. Now, many of those arguments are okay in the sense that I want to protect the health of my citizens. I want to protect, and so I use that as an excuse, and I bring it into the fold of, therefore, you should not be able to do this type of things. And in my country, we respect those rules. I'm creating, in a disguised manner, protection. Okay? So, as you see that in terms of trade, you see how GATT becomes WTO and what are the issues that WTO has to deal with. Whereas when we started with GATT, we were thinking only on tariffs, and then we started moving into quotas. As you really evolve into WTO, you're thinking about more than that. But in addition, whereas in the 1940s of the past century, goods were the very important trade element. It was trading of goods that was important. As you move into a globalized world, you go from goods to services to intellectual property to standards to this. Okay? And so what's happening in today's world is more complicated than it used to be. We not only discuss tariffs, now we have to discuss other aspects of trade, which make it very important. So in the end, you may be trading more on services than what you do on goods. And as your economy becomes a different economy, you produce less goods, you produce more services. What is it that makes the value of the iPhone that you have? Is it the piece, the casket, the shell of the telephone, or is the software that's inside, or is the applications that you use? What do you use your phone for? What do you use your phone for? That's one. Do you send text or do you send voice? Do you download things more frequently than you talk? Okay? So what you're seeing is, just by looking at the modern invention of that's why they are called smartphones, not anymore telephones, yeah? Because they do smart things for you. You really want to know what is the definition of, you get into your little telephone, you go into your Google, and you get, definition of juez. And that's what you are using your telephone for. Yeah, but every time you use that, what you are doing is you are downloading a service. You are downloading an application. As you do that, trade becomes more sophisticated. It's no longer, I bought the phone to make phone calls. If you were to buy the phone just to make phone calls, you wouldn't buy an iPhone 4G, okay? What do you need a 4G for? Why do you want to move from 3G to 4G? What I'm saying when I'm saying that? So you're talking technology, eh? And you're talking an evolution in technology that will allow what concretely? I mean, none of us is really a technical person, I guess. That's why we're in these degrees. But I mean, why are we in this buying an iPhone 4G rather than 3G? Because it gives me, the G means technology. And what it implies is I will be able to download faster than if I have a 3G. Now, you do have your 4Gs in Mexico, and it still downloads like a 3G. Why? Because the provider of services has not put the network that will allow you to go into. But you take that phone into the United States, and it becomes 4G, because it has the technology in itself, in the telephone, to use that new technology, 4G. The problem is the provider of the service is not ready in Mexico. Well, that's why they are making this investment in optic fiber and all these things that they are doing, okay? Because if they really want to use the telephone at the level that it's supposed to be performing, you need also the technology on their side. Yeah, but who developed that technology? Someone else. That someone else then has to sell the technology. In order to sell the technology, you're talking services and intellectual property. Okay? So, when we move into WTO, we switch the objectives. We concluded the Uruguay round, which was very important. And once we finished the Uruguay round, we knew that we had a different organization. That organization has, as of today, 158 countries. Okay? The last one was just approved in February, last month. And so what you have is a group of countries, 158. That means that there are not all the countries in the world in the WTO. Okay? But 158 countries have already agreed to be part of that organization. And as they are part of that organization, they agree that this is what would be the objective they are looking for when talking of trade. Number one, reduction of trade barriers for goods, for services, and for property rights. Okay? Second thing is, this organization is supposed to be a forum where people will be discussing how to make trade flow as smoothly, predictably, and free as possible. What we want will be total freedom, yeah? But we know that it's not happening. Nevertheless, this is the objective. The objective is, and you're going to see another video I'm going to show you, is people sit one in front of the other one in these long tables when they are working as the Council of WTO. And the point there is we are all equal, but at the same time we are right here because it is a dialogue. We're going to be talking about this thing. So it becomes really a forum where you will be talking about how can you make more smoothly, predictable, and free trade in the world. Then the third thing that's very important, and this you didn't have in GATT, is a mechanism to handle trade disputes. This is no longer somewhere where we try to find out the solution. It's now a mechanism. I can put a complaint against another country, telling them that they are not respecting the rules, and WTO has a trade dispute council, commission, where this will be taken into consideration, analyzed according to the rules, specified to make trade predictable. And if they are outside that, then there will be a judgment against the country which is applying some kind of mechanism to not allow trade. And therefore, this is a major difference with GATT. You didn't have this trade mechanism for the dispute of claims. Yes?
That's when we compare the WTO to the regional trade agreements, that was the point where they say that the regulation isn't good enough, even though it's supposed to be good, but it has hoops.
Yes. So part of the problem of what you need to do in the future is this is much better than it used to be with GATT. We still have some trouble. But if, in addition, I add that as I move into RTAs, I specify in this each one of these a trade dispute settlement mechanism, okay? Then I have several troubles because at some of them I may say, because Mexico, Canada, and the USA agreed to a trade dispute mechanism in NAFTA, then I may be saying that I will have to pass through this trade mechanism dispute in NAFTA rather than what GATT has, okay? And that could complicate life for everybody. And that's one of the major problems that we're facing right now. Just to give an example, one of the problems that we're facing right now is in the tuna industry. Not the tuna like in the fruit, but tuna. Because in tuna industry, which is a fisheries dispute in Mexico, between Mexico and the United States, we have a lot of discussions about that, and we finally went to the WTO for our complaint. And then, of course, the last thing that we are looking for is to promote economic stability, okay? Now, what this means is there are other Bretton Woods institutions. Remember, the GATT was created as part of the package of the Bretton Woods institutions. And so the Bretton Woods institutions were, at the beginning, First, the International Monetary Fund, which was supposed to be, or is supposed to be, the bank of the world, if you want to put it that way, which is not the same as the World Bank, which is a second institution. The World Bank real name is IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, okay? Because it was supposed to be, or is supposed to be, a development bank. So this is really the bank of the world. This is supposed to be a development bank. And then we wanted to have at the time something called ITO, International Trade Organization, okay? So these were the three institutions which are called Bretton Woods. And it's called Bretton Woods because that's the place where they were organized and put together. Now, these two we were able to work out. This one we were never able to do. So this became a more limited organization called GATT. As it became GATT, we knew and we saw what was happening, and this is the one that evolved into what was supposed to be the original ITO, and now it's called WTO, okay, the World Trade Organization. Because this was the whole conception, the idea is that you're going to have these three institutions to do something which is called promote economic stability in the world. Okay? The whole objective of having the IMF, the IBRD, and the ITO was to create the conditions of economic stability that had been lost and that had, in many people's minds, created the political and economic conditions for the Second World War. Okay? I mean, you are too young, and even I, but compared to what? Compared to the period that we're talking about. But what you have to look at is what was happening between 1920s, 1930s, 1940s of the past century, and see how many of the problems that were created for economic reasons following the settlement of the First World War created the conditions for the Second World War and for the rise of the Nazis and the whole system that was terrible and ended up in this Second World War. So when the Second World War finished, people sat and thought, how can we create conditions that will not bring back a situation like the ones that we face in the 20s and 30s? And the conception of many people was economic stability. How do you create economic stability? You create three organizations. Okay? One of them is going to be looking at the world financing, that's the IMF. The second one is going to be helping in reconstruction, particularly of Europe. That was the IBRD. And the third one is going to be looking at trade, ITO. Strange. 1 and 2 were able to put together, 3, very complicated. Okay? So we ended up with GATT, and GATT was defined as the General Agreement on Trade, and that tariffs and trade. And that was really simply a thing of how can I then reduce the protectionism in terms of tariffs. Now this is the evolution as you see it, okay? In the meantime, in the process, many things happen. And many of the reactions of people today come from the fact that there is a feeling that you created these organizations to be paternalistic and to dictate to developing nations the way that they should be growing in terms of the political system, in terms of the economic system. You don't allow them to do that. And so what you really were creating is a colonialist system that will impose the point of view of the United States, particularly because that was then the strongest nation. And many of the things that happened between the 50s, 60s, 70s of the past century, when you look at the world economic history, has to do with the fact that you started using these organizations to create conditions of growth and development, no longer in the reconstruction of the European war theater or Japan, China, but rather because then everything was okay with Europe. Europe starts growing again, you have all these things, and then you have the fight between the Soviet Union at the time and the free world. okay? Whatever you mean by free. And so in that combination, you again see political things getting into the workings of these institutions. And we start having all these programs of reform of the economy, this, that, which then brings this message that you are trying to colonize me through the use of these organizations, and therefore, whatever they are preaching is not something I will accept, because it imposes on my sovereignty to take my own decisions. Okay? As we move then, this is the biggest problem. This is what people are, use as, this is the colonialist aspect of these organizations. You still have a lot of that when you discuss in something called the WTO. And the problem with the WTO is that as an organization, it's very different. The decision mechanism is very different from these two organizations. What is the decision mechanism in the Monetary Fund? How do they take decisions?
Sorry,
how do they take decisions? Yeah. I am the staff member of the International Monetary Fund. I come to Mexico. I make a review, and Mexico is asking me for a loan. I have a problem as Mexico. I need reserves. I don't have enough reserves. Then I go to you and I say, I need you, IMF, to make a loan to me so I can have money to keep my economy going. Remember, the IMF is the banker of the world, okay? So what I'm going to be going to you is I'm going to go and say, I need reserves. How do you give me reserves?
You have to check if they can pay you back.
So you come to me, and what will you do if you're a bank? If you're a bank, you're a commercial bank, and I'm a normal citizen, I come to you, and I say, you're the loan officer of the bank, and I ask you money. And you ask me, what do you want the money for? Consumption. I want to eat food. What do you tell me?
I have to check if that's really what you are using the money for.
That's one thing, okay? So what you're going to do is, you're going to supervise me. Yeah? I want to check whether you really are going to use the money for those things that you said you were going to use it.
I have to check if you're going
And so I'm going to say to you, what, you don't trust me? You don't trust me, you see? This is the kind of colonialism I was talking about. Because what it implies is, if you're going to be supervising me, then you are telling me what I can and I cannot do with that money. Yeah? And that implies you are infringing upon my sovereignty. Remember, we are not talking people, we are talking countries. And so, the feeling is, you're imposing conditions on me. And then you supervise me. And therefore, you are trying to impose your point of view on me.
But you agreed on that when you signed as a member.
But, what is the meaning in the IMF and the World Bank when compared to WTO? These are pretty similar. This is different. In what sense? What is the meaning of that? Say it strong so they can tape you.
Like United States is on.
Okay. This is a bank, and therefore I'm going to be putting capital, and the proportion of that will give me shares, and that will imply who can make decisions. Because I need to control then 50 plus of the shares, and this is what decides, yeah? I don't remember right now what is the structure of capital, but then what it implies is, if I'm the United States, and I have 25% of the shares, and you are the European Union, and you have 18% of the shares, the two of us have already 43% of the shares. Therefore, we have 43% of the decision power in this organization.
So all the members have equal shares?
Yeah. When you subscribe to the IMF or the World Bank, you subscribe as a shareholder. And what you do then is you subscribe a proportion of shares. One of the problems that we're facing right now in terms of the overall organization in the world is the IMF and the World Bank have a share composition which do not really reflect anymore the relative importance of countries in the world. Because what it does reflect in great measure is the situation in 1946-47, at the end of the Second World War and the constitution of all these organizations, okay? At that time, the only one with money, let's put it that way, was the United States, yeah? The rest were all bankrupt. Europe was bankrupt, Japan was in shambles, everything else. And so what happened at the time is I went and I created these organizations, then I subscribed shares, and I had voting power according to my share proportion. And so the largest shareholder has the largest voice, and that's the United States. And then you go slowly, now you have China, all these countries, but they have to buy shares, and then they say, I am going to be providing capital, and I put this amount of money, and I get this proportion of shares. As you move in that sense, the amount of capital of each one of these organizations, the IMF and the IBRD, is allocated in proportion to the shares that you bought by bringing capital. As you do that, you sit on a table, and in that table, you vote according to your share power. Okay? The decision-making process is faster than here. Because in WTO, you basically have to go by consensus. Okay? And consensus practically means one vote, one country, and one country can stop a negotiation if they say, I don't agree.
Going back to IMF, where's Mexico in that?
I don't know right now proportion, but we are one of the largest shareholders, but in proportion not that big. Not because we don't have the capacity and the money right now to do it, but because in order for you to buy now, you have to buy someone else. Someone has to decide to sell so you can buy. Because this is not really a typical business situation, what you have is negotiations so you can increase your power in the definition of the bank, okay? And I don't remember the last thing, but in the last round of this type of negotiation, the United States agreed to dilute its capital, meaning, either you can increase the capital and I won't participate, or I will sell part of my shares to you. And so China now has a larger power than it used to have before. Russia, Mexico, Brazil. These are countries who have been able to put more money into that situation.
But the US is still the biggest.
Oh yeah, the United States must have about 20, maybe not 25 anymore, but they must be somewhere close to that. Okay.
So who decided IMF,
The board. Yeah. And so the board is comprised of 100 of the chairs. So if I own 20%, I have 1/5 of the power to decide. Yep. And if I'm friends of the other guy who has 20, he and I may have 40%. Still, you can lose. So we need to get people for another 10%. Okay? You'll have to go to you can go to the IMF and you will see how's the composition and what they mean. But basically what it means is that the chairs around the table are defined in proportion to this. Now, you can have a chair if you have at least a certain minimum. I don't know, I think it's 5% of the capital. So many countries, what they do is they put together their chairs. For instance, we are with Spain. And so Mexico, Spain, and Central American countries, they all contribute, and we have one chair. Okay? The chair has two positions, the one who is the ambassador and the second one who is the supplier, okay? And when you put these things together, really what it means is the process of decision making at the IMF and the World Bank, two of the institutions built as part of this concept of stabilizing the world economy, is not given by the principle of one person, one vote, but by the principle of who has the most money moves the game, okay? Because of that, you have all these concepts that you are trying to colonize me, because the big ones are the United States, European Union, etc. So why is it that every single time we have a president of the World Bank who is an American? Why is it that we have every single time the concept that the president or the director, general director of the IMF is a European? Because that was the agreement made between them, and it has nothing to do with who is more competent. It's simply who can call the shots.
So the leaders are also elected by proportional?
Yep. But in the end, what happens is there's negotiations behind, you know. But yes, this is the problem of the IMF and the World Bank, okay? But at the same time, this is the beauty of them, because you can take decisions very quickly. Whereas here, decisions are very cumbersome and complicated. Okay? So WTO, and we are going to see that, has to work with the other Bretton Woods agencies, because the whole idea is the combination of them all will allow us to create and promote economic stability in the world. So one of the things that you will see is, yes, when the IMF goes to check a country's situation, we'll need to make sure that that country also follows the rules of WTO. In other words, a negotiation between a country and the IMF, where the IMF says, well, yeah, you have to do this and you have to do that, cannot contradict the rules of WTO. And the rules of WTO cannot contradict the rules of the IMF or the World Bank. There has to be coordination between the three institutions and many other regional institutions. The Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, which are all these kind of organizations, all of them have to work together. Okay? This really means, if I come to you guys and you say to me, I'm the IMF, and say, well, you have to do certain things and you have to reduce the deficit in your balance of payment. And then you say to me, fine, I'm going to increase tariffs. I cannot accept that unless I talk to WTO and we are in agreement that this is an exception that within the rules of WTO is allowed. Okay? And then it has to have temporality, etc. Again, the problem is when we're talking about these things, this is the purpose is very clear. It's positive. I want to promote economic stability in the world. I want to promote free trade in the world. I want to promote financing in the world. But when I start negotiating, it can become very easily constructed into you are trying to impose rules of the Americans or the Europeans into my decision-making country, decision-making process as a country. Okay? Okay. So these are, just so that you can keep it, the four objectives are these four objectives, okay? That's the whole idea of the WTO. And then the agreements, they are called agreements. These are the legal documents of the WTO, and they are called agreements. Salud. And what that means is the agreements will cover goods, services, and intellectual property. This is what we agreed will be part of the rules that we will impose on each other. 158 nations accept that there are certain rules, a legal document, the agreement, and that will be goods, services, and intellectual property. Okay? These are the three things. Hey, no, I'm talking, these are the three things. But I'm talking about something else. Yeah, that's not part of the agreements, and therefore is not under the jurisdiction of WTO.
What are the requirements to be accepted
Now we are going to see that. It's called the Accession Principles. How do you accede into my organization? You have to ask permission. There is a long way of things. And in addition, you basically have to negotiate country by country, which is already there, that they will not veto you because of certain things. So what means in the end is when you start getting part, you want to be part of the club, you have to fulfill the rules of the club. So the first thing you have to do is you have to accept the general agreements as they may be at that moment in time, okay? But then in addition, you have to go to each country, and each and every one of them has to say, yes, I give him my blessing. He can get into the club. Now, in order to do that, what we did with the Chinese is we walked to the Chinese and said, you really want to be part of the team? Mexico was the last country to accept the accession of China into WTO. And so when we negotiated with them, it was fascinating because the guys will say, well, look, I mean, you're the only one. And you're not going to stop us? I said, yes, I'm going to stop you. Because I need the following things. And so we asked them exemption from the rules of WTO on certain trade issues, particularly textiles, shoes, and other products that our producers were very, very concerned. And so you go and you say, the rules of WTO will not apply between you and I for the next, and so we went there and we asked for 20 years. And the guys came back and said, wait. The most we have given was to the Americans, and we gave the Americans 5 years. I said, well, that's your problem, okay? My problem is with you, and my problem with you is I need at least 20. And that was the start of the negotiation. And then we spent several months, one final trip to Beijing, sit down with these guys and say, either you give me this or ciao. And to my surprise, they stood up and disappeared, okay? It was fascinating. This is a long table. There are 5 of us and about 20,000 on the other side. And so you are sitting there discussing with them, and then all of a sudden you tell these guys, look, this is what we want. And all of this in Chinese is very complicated, okay? So what happened was I was sitting on this side, and I brought with me, that was a surprise to them, because I brought a Chinese speaker, Mexican. The rule in the negotiation, because they think that you don't have anyone who speaks Chinese, yeah, is they will provide you with a translator. And the answer I gave is, wait a minute, I'm not going to go with the Chinese translator, you know. Of course, I speak zero Chinese, but the point was, well, actually I can say xie or something. But from the standpoint of the negotiator, it would be terrible to go and negotiate with someone from their side. So we looked for someone, and we found a person who spoke perfect Mandarin. And so I hired her. I said, look, I'm going to bring you with me. We're going to go there. And you sit behind me. And you're going to be expressing what they want, and you will tell me what they are saying, okay? But the one thing that's very important to me, more than anything else, is I want to feel the tension. Because that's very important in the negotiating process. I don't know how you negotiate, but negotiations is how much I'm really making this man uncomfortable, you know? So we're sitting there, and the whole point I was making to her is, look, I honestly, the biggest problem with Chinese for me, at least for me, is that I have no feeling whether the person is getting more or less mad, if you wish, tense, whatever. Because it sounds the same to me. You know? I mean, you can see when you are with a friend and he starts getting upset because you can see the raising of the tone but in Chinese, at least for me, it's very difficult. So I said, all I want you to do is tell me how mad he is. That's all. And so she said, why? I said, because that's the point of negotiating, okay? And so we got there, and this guy really got mad. So he was the Minister of Trade of China, and all of a sudden he just stood up and said, enough, I'm walking off. And he just walked off, and then there was only 5 of us on that room, okay? Because it was fascinating, because we're sitting there, and I'm kidding a little bit, but on that side we're about 40 people. That's how they negotiate. They bring a lot of people. And we were only 5 because it's very expensive to go to China. So we are there, and this guy just stand up. Everybody's surprised. And as this gentleman walks out, everybody else walks behind him. And so we were left standing in this room, huge, and no idea what was going on, okay? So that lasted for about 20 minutes. And then all of a sudden, a person walked in and said, Mr. Minister, the minister would like to talk to you in private. And I said, wait, in private with my translator, okay? And so we went there and we were in private, and that was a different discussion, okay? And then he explained to me the reasons why, and then I explained to him the reasons why. And he said, but I can't do either. And he says, well, this. And I said, we are a democracy, and you know, I have to deal with my own groups. And so, and he said, well, yeah, but we are also a democracy, and we have to deal with our own groups. And I said, well, but you are the one who wants to get in. And so in the end, we got 7 years, which was the biggest concession they gave to anyone. So all of this means, all this technical thing.
Why do they speak English?
Oh, they don't speak English, they don't speak French, they don't speak anything. And basically, the group of people I was talking, you have to remember one thing. Every 10 years they change the guard, yeah? The people I was talking to at the time, we're talking 2001. The people I was talking to were very old people who had been raised in a completely different environment from the one of the people who are right now, okay? So they honestly didn't speak English. To my surprise, a few spoke Spanish. But what I found out is that I spoke French. And in the end, I spoke French. My conversation with this guy in the end was in French. And that was very different. Once you speak the same language, it makes a different approach, okay? But they use the language barrier as a barrier. They use it very, very well. I used to make negotiations with the World Bank when I was at the World Bank with the Japanese, and they will always speak Japanese to you. Even though you know that they speak English, they will speak Japanese to you. And so I did that trick also with them. I brought this lovely Irish lady who spoke perfect Japanese, and I asked her, don't speak Japanese. Let them believe that we don't speak Japanese. And that was great. Because what happened is they began talking Japanese in front of us. Because they were so convinced that we were so dumb that we didn't speak Japanese, that it was nice. And she wanted to say things, says, don't say anything, just let them speak. Take notes. And that allows us to negotiate better, yeah? So I know what they are talking. And they don't know that I know. So never, never, never lose an advantage, okay? I'm sorry, this is negotiations 101. So what is the meaning then of the agreements? The agreements, in fact, fall into a simple structure with 6 main parts, okay? This meaning the legal structure under which we have this are 6 things. One is what's called the umbrella agreement, which is the agreement establishing the WTO. These are the general rules that establish WTO, okay? This is, if you wish to call it that way, the constitution of WTO. The basic document, the basic rules that you have to follow. And it's called an umbrella agreement. Then the second one is agreements that you have to deal with for each of the 3 broad areas of trade that the WTO covers, which are goods, services, and intellectual property. So you have the rules for each one of these. And we're going to go through them. It's going to be a little boring for you, but we have to look at them, okay? So what you're looking at is agreements for each one of the 3 broad areas that trade. One on goods, what is that you can and you cannot do in goods. One on services, how service trade is going to be managed. And the third one, which is very contentious, is intellectual property, okay? This is patents and things of that sort. Then you have the interesting thing, which is the definition of how you're going to be settling disputes between members of WTO, and the rules to which they have agreed. And therefore, once there is a dispute, you go to this, if you're going to call it tribunal, which is not really a tribunal, it's a council of settlement, and this dispute settlement is going to be defined beforehand what will happen, what are the rules, how you have to present your documents, what kind of information you have to provide. And then that council will make a decision, and once they make the decision, that decision is compulsory on you. And then the review of government trade policies. This is very important because what it implies is I'm going to be supervising. How do you do? your trade policy. So as a country, you agree that WTO can check on you from time to time and make a review of your trade policy. Now, what it implies simply is that you're going to be examined every X number of years. They probably do it every 3 years or so. And so one of the things that you can find, if you really want to know about trade in a country, and this is important for you if you're going to be in international businesses, is you have to know that if you go into the WTO document section, you will be able to see what kind of trade policy are following in each one of these countries. And that will give you information on legislation, problems, etc., that they are facing. That's information that you may need as a business person later on. But there is, in addition to that, 2 plurilateral agreements. Okay? Now, these 2 plurilateral agreements are not part of the agreements in the sense that they have not been signed by all members. So yes, there are rules for certain areas, but because they are not signed by all members, they are not really part of the overall structure. Okay? And these 2 plurilateral agreements, which are not signed by all members and not included in the general agreements, are civil aircraft and government procurement. These are 2 very important areas, okay? Because what it implies is how is going to be the whole movement of planes and these things. But also this one is more important for many people because what it implies is some countries will reserve the right that purchases of the government will be conditioned to certain things. And there are countries that will say the government can only buy from Mexicans. They cannot buy products from Europeans, this and that. So every purchase that the Mexican government is going to make will have to be made of Mexican suppliers. Now, this is not the case of Mexico, obviously, but what I'm saying is that, which is very important, government procurement, in many countries, the biggest purchaser in the economy is the government, then will be exempt from some of these rules. That's why there is so much discussion on this issue. And as you move into RTAs, one of the things that you will see appearing more and more frequently is agreements on government procurement. Because what it will imply is the United States, Mexico, and Canada agree that purchases from these 3 governments can be made to foreigners in the sense of members of the RTA, Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Okay? That's why this is slowly getting into the act. And what is happening is there is now a plurilateral agreement. Many countries have agreed, and we will see which countries are later on. Okay? So synthesizing, and we finish the class there. Okay? The basic structure of WTO agreements and how they fit together. You have the umbrella agreement, which establishes WTO and the rules. Okay? And then you have 3 agreements which go into goods, services, and intellectual property. This agreement on goods is basically the agreement that you had in GATT. Okay? And what it really means is whatever was there is going to remain. The Uruguay round, the last round of GATT, defined what were the rules in this one. In services, you have another one which is called the GATS, General Agreement on Trades and Services. And that's the umbrella agreement. Has annexes where it will say what are the services, what are the conditions, etc. And they also have what is called the country's schedules and commitments, okay? Which implies the definition country by country of what will be the tariffs, what will be the things on each one of the goods. Once they have done that, they are committed to fulfill those rules. So if I say that a car will get into Mexico, and I agree with the overall tariff system on cars, and the tariff on car is only 5%, then cars can get into Mexico with 5%, because that's what we all agree all over the world. Okay? Oh, but I want to raise to 10%, you can't. There are exceptions, yes, and those exceptions are present in these agreements. Okay? Same thing for services, same thing for intellectual property. The rights on intellectual property. Okay? So it's the trade on intellectual property and the rights that they have, the goods and services. Which implies, if I have a patent, then you are forced to fulfill the rules of that patent all over the world. But there are conditions on which I will do. And then you go into the other two aspects, dispute settlement and transparency. This is WTO in action. Okay? We're going to start with this video next class.